So I hope to give you a glimpse into our practice, how it's evolved, quite frankly, how I've changed considerably over the past 10 years. I still love and believe deeply in architecture and the work we do. I think that it is one of the most exciting professions you could be privileged to participate in. At the same time, I'm asking a lot of questions about what it means to be a humanitarian at this point in my career, and challenging my colleagues to think about how we can contribute to communities in other meaningful ways. We decided 15 years ago to take over 50% of the profits annually and invest them in properties around the world and place them in conservation easements as a way of exploring what it means to contribute to biodiversity and ecology. This has taken me to a place of a search of rootedness. What does it mean to truly authenticate a building, a response, any intervention? It's also moved me in the direction of wanting to fully understand whether it's a rural, a suburban, an urban project. What watershed does it reside in? Where in the watershed does it reside? What is the unique flora and fauna in that watershed? What are the soils? I'm obsessed with soils. Soils contribute so much. There is 1 billion bacteria in 1 gram of soil. The amount of life in soil is overwhelming. It filters water. It's responsible for the way we cultivate our landscape. And as I've discussed with a number of you, it moves us to understand invasive species and how removing invasive species can change not only the spatial characteristics of the forest, but change biodiversity and its contributions to the impact of climate change. So as we think about ecology and we talk about projects, I'm going to begin with a property that we bought 15 years ago. I received an email from a gentleman that was intrigued with my perspective on soils, and as an architect, my belief in that architects should begin with courses in ecology. We emailed back and forth for a few days, and then he invited me down south to Patagonia, Chile. I didn't realize who I was speaking to, but I was speaking to Doug Tompkins. Doug started North Face in Esprit. His wife started Patagonia. She was the CEO. At 49 years old, Doug sold out of Esprit for a few $1 billion, moved down to Chile, and over the course of 20 years bought 2.5 million acres in different parcels throughout Patagonia, Chile, and Argentina, leveraged it into 25 million acres in 17 national parks. I negotiated to buy this piece of land, which is this parcel, which is 600 and something acres in the Corcovado National Park. It's the only parcel that is privately owned, and we're working with ecologists in South America to determine how we can increase biodiversity there, how the site can measure climate change, and other ways that we can contribute as architects to this beautiful place. Every March, a pod of orcas come into the bay. It's a place of mountains, Rio Tiktok, Rio Bahia Tiktok, and just a stunning place that is extremely dynamic and full of life. Here you see the Andes mountains, some of the Coihue forest, some of the alerce forest. Alerce trees there grow to over 2,000 years old, and just a stunningly beautiful place. We're also mapping the beach edge, the way this black sand evolves over time, how hydrology and how the ocean's currents, the currents in the bays, change the shape of these edges and what it means to biodiversity. And over time, throughout the seasons, the impact of the hydrology and the movement through this unique watershed, and what it means to built works there. Are we responsible at all intervening in any way in a landscape such as this? Will it in some way diminish biodiversity? Will it shift? Will it reduce the number of bees? We're studying how we increase the bees, how we increase the birds. Something as an architect I've become somewhat obsessed with and want to understand more before we intervene. I think we're not asking the most basic question of, is it appropriate to intervene? Should we even build? We just assume and we do. What does it mean to materiality? Identifying the types of clays, What can we do with these clays? What is embedded in the composition of clay, sand, and silt? And how can we shape and build with these different materials? And how, along the bluff's edges, in the dunes, what is the flora in these unique conditions? And how does biodiversity change as we move from the beach edge through the dunes, through some of the wetlands, into other parts of the watershed? And then what other flora, fauna, mosses, lichens, what develops there, and how it changes throughout the seasons? And what does that mean to life at all scales? We have built one intervention. We found a series of fallen caraway trees. We brought in a saw. We cut these large mass timbers into 6-inch thick, 2 feet wide, 12 feet long, and we blind pegged this 300-foot pier, which is just a stunning intervention in this landscape. A pier that belongs to the landscape, not the few cottages that are there. And so we also think about materiality, the iron in soils. What is there? Whether it's steel plate, another obsession I have, Richard Serra's steel plate. What is the properties of this plate? How is the difference of a 2-inch steel plate from a 1/4-inch plate? It's vastly different the way it ages in patinas because of the heating and rolling. And so if you ever meet with Dillinger Steel in Germany, they'll tell you it's why Serra's pieces are stunningly beautiful and age differently than we as architects when we apply a 1/4 or an 1/8-inch rain screen. It's going to age differently. It will feel different. We were granted access at Dia Beacon to projecting light on these panels and studying their reflective qualities for a number of structures, how they aged, how they wear, what the human hand does, what the oils of a hand do to these plates, and what they mean to expression. But I'm also, I feel strongly about challenging the amount of documentation we bring to architecture. I question whether we're over-documenting. And I question whether we should adopt some of the principles of some of the Japanese artists that speak often about muting the ego and assigning a voice to external forces. Here, Shozo Michikawa takes a block of clay, he scores it, and then he takes either his hand or a finger or a broomstick and just rams it into the block and allows that spinning process to create something that is stunningly beautiful but unpredictable. So to me, it's not only about intention, but it's about embracing accident. I am now having conversations with contractors who seem to embrace accident daily and enjoy the idea of accident, and wondering if we should reposition our drawings to contemplate or maybe even pursue an agenda of accident, a way of maybe creating buildings that are less human and more connected to the natural world. And so a series of his images. But I'm also deeply moved by the Raku family. If you're unfamiliar with their story, in 1580, the warlord in Kyoto asked Shinnu Rikyu, who was the master of tea at that time, to identify someone that could create the most avant-garde tea bowls in all of Japan. Rikyu reached out to Tanaka Chojuro. Chojuro was making the roof tiles out of clay for the Temple of Peace. Chojuro created 23 tea bowls. Not a one has ever been allowed to leave Japan. There's one that's a knockoff in the Met. It says attributed. But these bowls are stunningly beautiful, and they're about stillness. The warlord was so intimidated by Shinnu Rikyu that he directed him to cause ritual suicide. He took his life. It became such a powerful story in 1590 that he ended up, the warlord, assigning to Chojuro the title of Raku. They are now in their 16th generation and creating some of the most stunning tea bowls. They speak often of the tea bowls of Japan of 1580 setting the modern movement. They place them above and before the 1930 black painting of Malevich. They often speak of its relationship to Duchamp's urinal, and they often speak of it setting the tone for stillness as it relates to Rothko's work. Here you see another artist, Shiro Tsutsumura's work. He has a series of these in the Met. and they're extremely quiet. They create a unique universe that, to me, we seek to achieve in our work. The unique kodai, or the foot of the T-bow, something that is extremely important and affects the inner universe of the other side. And so all this speaks to culture. Growing up in Louisiana and New Orleans, we often speak of life and life that exists in the public spaces. But we also think about death, especially the way the black community celebrates death, or celebrates life and death, and their expression of death in Louisiana, those unique cemeteries, and how that processional aspect of death, the burial, takes place in the public space. It's fascinating to me that you can have a funeral in New Orleans in the streets and no permits required. You can shut down a street and process for 6 or so blocks. So returning to the soils, we begin, as I mentioned earlier, with identifying the watershed of each project, its unique soil condition, the red alluvium on this project in Natchitoches, Louisiana, studying the ancient meanders of the Mississippi River pre-levee, the impact that's had on Louisiana. Louisiana's losing a football field every 40 minutes due to the leveeing of the Mississippi and the lack of distribution of fresh water and sediment. So these are the Harold Fisk maps that document the meanders of the Mississippi River pre-levee. And so we begin to map these things, we build models of these things, we attempt to understand at the scale of a granule of soil how these different particles stratified in water deposit and scour, and how they shape space, and what that means to circulation strategies in a small community of Natchitoches, Louisiana, and how we should think about connecting to water, and what that annual flooding cycle means where the levee has been broken. And so this was a 27,000 square foot museum, a Sports Hall of Fame and History Museum in Natchitoches, the oldest settlement in the Louisiana Purchase Territory, a place where the earliest built structures were of bousillage, clay, horsehair, and moss. And here, of course, you see throughout Louisiana the different soil coloration because of the soil types throughout the state. And so we begin to think about, can we create a contemporary version of this bousillage? And so we look to packing mud or bousillage in forms and move to kind of a combination of a cast stone bousillage mixture, created over 1,100 cast stone bousillage panel forms out of routed foam. And here you begin to see some of the panels for this Sports Hall of Fame History Museum. Some of these weigh 6 to 7 tons. We had a series of engineers working on the project. Every time they would attach a panel to the inner steel frame, it would deflect or deform the frame, and so they had to recalculate the placement of the next panel to place it so that it returned the frame to achieve 3/8 inch tolerances between each panel. Some of these are up to 20-something feet long. They're each a nominal 5-inch thickness, but beautifully respond to the connecting this Sports Hall of Fame and Museum to the broader context, the circulation pattern. And then as we begin to think about the exterior, we thought about the historic plantations and questioned if we should use some of these strategies for mitigating light and air and apply them to the exterior, and decided it was appropriate. So the exterior is a hand-pleated copper. This building was built for $12.8 million, or $450 a square foot. An interesting story, we worked for 2.5 years with a dry cast stone supplier out of Atlanta. He identified that if we built a structure out of a certain square footage of type A panel, type B panel, and type C panel, we would be in budget. When we bid the project, he bid twice the number he gave us per square foot, and it came in $7 million over. The state directed me to redraw the project. We were already over $1 million in the hole on drawings. We identified another cast stone supplier that did wet cast stone. changed one line in the spec, put it right back out to bid, rebid it, and it came in $300,000 over under the bid. One line in the spec. So the exterior is pleated copper. As you can see, it connects with the unique filtering or louvers of those historic sinker cypress louvers of the important vernacular architecture of Louisiana. And some of the pleated copper panels, and the way it's aged in patina, because each section throughout the exterior is unique, and it's just kind of painting this unique, beautiful painting as the copper ages. And then as you move internally into the space, to the left, the front porch, connecting back historically to the body of water, and then as you move internally, a unique way of beginning to the confluence of these two unique programs and how they can support each other. The complexity of skylights above, the complexity of sprinklers, lights in these complex shapes, and then once again, the porch. Ultasol, which is in the Atlanta region. One thing we realized after we had completed the Sports Hall of Fame in Natchitoches was that a byproduct of that project was over 1,100 styrofoam panels. And we felt like we were terribly irresponsible in using that process of making to create something, although the project was recognized that we should think more holistically about design and the process of making. And so we were selected to design the Alliance Theater at the Woodruff Arts Center, and quickly determined that we would return to the soil and artistry of place, but also think a lot about what we refer to as spatializing equity. How can we bring to a building typology that historically divided and segregated an aspect of community, of equity, of equality to this space? And so begin to think about how with technology could we begin to shape, how we could use materials in a more responsible fashion, how the broader community could connect to the proscenium, and each person feel or experience equal sight lines, quality sight lines, acoustical, all of these issues began to inform the shaping of this room. And so we began to think about the Malthrop bowls there, and how the potential for using reclaimed white oak might inform a way of thinking about this space. Here the Malthrop bowls, beautifully, that shaving or shaping of these beautiful bowls. But how we could use reclaimed white oak to shape and respond to not only sight lines, but acoustics. And so we commissioned a Brooklyn artist by the name of Matthias Plisnig to work with us to create mock-ups of each of these panels. He used these C-clamps, and in working with Rick Talaski, the acoustical engineer, we began to place each and every ribbon in the whole room on these mock-ups as a way of responding to directing sound to each specific seat, or creating divergent ribbons for absorption. And so here you see the density of these ribbons as we move around a number of these mock-ups. And so one of the finished panels, each of these panels were constructed off-site in the Boston area and shipped down to the Atlanta area and then spliced into place. But we're also an advocate of technology. How do we use technology to achieve economies of scale? This room, which was originally budgeted at almost $30 million, was built for under $19 million. And it's because of this innovative use of laser projection and using it to place each of the ribbons in the room. C.W. Keller, we moved the mock-ups from Matthias Plisnig to C.W. Keller, and here you see the projection of lasers to identify and place each ribbon in the room. And then some of the larger, more beautiful panels that show you the convergence for directing or reflecting sound, and then of course the divergent ribbons for the absorptive areas in the room. And so the completed room which was completed about 2 years ago. Yeah, with each of these reclaimed white oak pieces. So for us, it was about equity, it was about ecology, it was about achieving something that was at or below the client's budget and hopefully beyond their expectations. It's in Atlanta at the Woodruff Art Center. Yep. Gulf Coast Black Marsh. Some of the marshes of Louisiana, and some of the citrus trees that were that are immediately south of New Orleans. This is a commission at Loyola University, a very small chapel, and for us it was about mystery, the challenging the predictability of the arrival sequence and threshold, and maybe reorganizing the vault, the arch, the dome in ways that may increase mystery in this space. And so we began with the carving of St. Ignatius Cave and began to think about the materiality here. But then the evolution of the church and the dome and the proportional systems that were used, and thinking a lot about the reorganization of these, not only volumetrically and spatially, but in their acoustical contributions. And so I remembered another Japanese artist that we collect, Genta Ishizuka, who was one day walking home and he saw this little old lady with a bag of oranges, and he thought a lot about spirituality and the church and these in creating dome shapes, and spoke to me about this. And so he began to create these incredible lacquer pieces out of these, not oranges, but actually styrofoam balls. And so he applies 25 to 30 coats of lacquer to these pieces. They're highly reflective, they're stunningly beautiful, and they're mysterious in so many ways. And so we purchased a series of these, brought these to the office, and studied the relationship of these spheres, cut some of these open, and then began to create cast concrete models of some of these, and begin to think about the reorganization of the traditional church and that arch and that dome, and could we bring that to the interior space. And so we created a series of, I think, 30 or 40 of these cast concrete pieces using balloons filled with water and air, sometimes just air, and the kind of deformation of these, so losing that purity, or almost taking the dome or the arch to something that may align with the natural world more than the human world, and thinking about the plan of this space and what it means today. Psychopisces, the threshold, what does it mean, these interpenetrating circles? And so could we take that thinking of the dome, the shape, the arch, and begin to bring that into the plan and create these unique, beautiful points where the threshold occurs between each space. A chapel, a seating capacity of 250 people, a very small space, but you see the overlap of these spaces and the kind of convergence of these as we began to slice and pull apart the Genta Ishizuka sculptural pieces. So it's our way of thinking about art, and how can art inform some of our architecture. And then beginning to think of it in mass, its placement on the campus, its relationship to the historic buildings of Loyola. And so we proceeded to move in the direction of a cast-in-place concrete structure with some of these domed pieces carved out internally, and these slices in relationship to other connections, a historic oak tree that's very meaningful to the campus, and then these gills, so to speak, that bring natural light into this small cylinder of space. Alamans Harhan West Wego, probably a commission we're most excited about. We received a call a couple of years from a gentleman who owns a very important black funeral home in New Orleans. And he asked us if we were interested in embarking on a journey that would involve at least 1 year of studying the funeral, death in the black community in New Orleans, and what that means to his community. We accepted the commission, and he proceeded to purchase an entire city block in the 9th Ward, and he's increased the program to include a food kitchen, a museum to the black funeral, and a number of other programs that are still evolving and developing. But it's about the second line, and if you're not familiar with the second line developed in the late 1860s, and it was how a funeral develops. The band, the jazz band, the family, and the casket begin the processional aspect. But then as the community joins in and becomes part of it, and how they at times move throughout the community, and at times they move throughout the historic cemeteries, and how they've evolved over time and informed or participated in the second line. And what that means to burial in New Orleans today. And so we're in the early conceptual stages of the funeral home. We are at this time proceeding with rammed earth, this black rammed earth that we are excavating from the site itself. We're applying lime to it as a way of stabilizing it, and we think it's something that can create something stunningly beautiful, retrieving that soil or that earth from the site itself. But we're also studying a number of configurations and how the second line will move throughout the site and move beyond the site at times and contribute to neighborhood, and what that means to the broader neighborhood. And so here is a series of diagrams of the second line and how it moves or originates on the site, concludes on the site, but moves and activates various parts of the immediate neighborhood community. This has moved us to thinking about regenerative ecology and education and opportunity and shared value and community and sustainability and well-being, which has led us to forming what we call Designing for Democracy, a 501c3 that's about spatializing equity. And so it's our interest, or it's our way of developing or taking or moving architecture for us to a different place. I mentioned we buy properties, so our most recent acquisition is in Natchitoches, is in St. Francisville, Louisiana, which is home to what is referred to as Live Oak, one of the Bennett Barrow plantations. Bennett Barrow owned 5 plantations in the area. The atrocities that took place are significant. He documented them in the Bennett Barrow diary, which is at the LSU Library. But it's our way of moving into an area of thinking about healing in community. And do we have a responsibility as architects to think about healing our communities? And so here it's about low soils. Low soils at the particle level is a soil where each sand granule is coated in clay. And so they're very stable in a horizontal position, and a very unstable in a horizontal and a slope configuration, and very stable in a vertical configuration. And so we're studying those soils and what they meant to plantation life and cultivation of the landscape. A map of how the indigenous people moved throughout the landscape at this time, this period in history. And then another map which gives you a sense of the percentage of people that were enslaved in 1860. And what you will see is in West Feliciana Parish in 1860, 82.3% of the people were enslaved. And so this has taken us to a place where we are funding and sponsoring the first Truth, Witness, and Justice project to historic and contemporary slavery in the U.S. We have ethnographers in the community. We have archaeologists in the community. The ethnographers are identifying the descendants of those that were enslaved on this property. They're also identifying who is incarcerated at Angola prison, which is 10 minutes from here. They believe it's in the 70% range, that 70% of those incarcerated at Angola are descendants of the enslaved. And we're pursuing what it means to heal a community. And we think as architects that we need to move in this direction of thinking about these issues, because it has spatial consequences. Our legal systems were informed by this period in history. Our healthcare systems were informed. And architecturally, in many ways, we practice in ways and think spatially based on this period in history. Interesting documents we found in the plantation and in the courthouse records, where Bennett Barrow assigned higher values to the ox or to the mule than to a human being. And so a few images of live oak. There are over 300 trees that are over 200 years old. We're still in search of the enslaved graves. We have spent the past 2.5 years editing the forest to return them to their agrarian spatial conditions of this period. We have identified a number of various significant sites that are late 1700s, early 1800s as far as built structures. We're going to slowly return this 1808 structure to its appropriate expression, and that is, although it's whitewashed here, it was Anglo-influenced, and the bricks were actually red, and the mortar joints were painted white, and so we're going to slowly return it to that truthfulness of expression. We're planting ryegrass, but we are slowly moving to planting indigo. We took over 200 samples, material samples in the historic house, and identified that the first paint trim color was blue or indigo, and so we're going to return indigo to the property. We brought in Abubakar Fofana out of Bamako, Africa, and he is teaching us how indigo was used originally for medicinal purposes. They would take an indigo leaf and rub it on a cut or place it in their mouth. And so he's educating the community on how indigo as a crop can be a crop for healing a community. And so just a number of ways that we're thinking about healing the community. The ryegrass, it's a cover crop we will let grow. As I've talked with others, we are slowly removing the invasive species. It's significant on a property like that, which is trifoliate orange and privet. It changes the spatial conditions of the forest, and as I mentioned earlier, the biodiversity. Some of the lower fields, but the house is positioned in a position of power. It's on the high ground. I find it intriguing that Bennett Barrow planted this oak alley, and these trees were documented at about 10 feet tall. The thinking that these trees would be there for hundreds of years to create this impressive oak alley, or this extruded threshold, right, to elevate the house to this position of power. And so just a number of field conditions. And then recently a find that we're really excited about as we begin to pull back the forested areas. We found on the property the indigenous people's Tunica Trail that's 500 to 1,000 years old. Since it's in low soils, it at times carves, at times up to 20 feet deep throughout the site. And so archaeologists are now beginning to study and dig and pursue what is embedded in this historic trail. So, thank you.